A large portion of the Jewish nation has returned to its homeland, but the heart, soul, and mind of much of the Jewish nation are still in exile mode. This state of affairs must and will inevitably change. This is Torah Nation TV from Jerusalem, and we are speaking with the head of Machon, Shilo, Rabbi David Bar-Hayim. Shalom, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. Does the Torah encourage vegetarianism?
In a word, the answer to your question is no. Judaism has never supported vegetarianism as a way of life or as an ideology. The history of the concept of vegetarianism is a very recent one, and essentially it contradicts everything we know about the habits of human beings in almost every culture, every nation throughout the world, for all of recorded history, and probably based on everything we know, certainly based on anthropology, etc. It contradicts everything we know about human beings from time immemorial. One can simply test this fact by looking around the world today and looking in historical records, and one discovers that essentially in every culture human beings ate meat and fish and dairy products, eggs, etc., with the possible exception of some parts of the Indian subcontinent. Eating animal products, animal protein, animal fats have always been part of the human diet. And this is clearly what we find in the Torah. We find that all our forefathers consumed meat and animal products. When, for example, at the beginning of Parashat Vayera in Sefer Bereshith, the book of Genesis, chapter 18, when Avraham Avinu saw these three people, or what he thought were three people approaching him, and he invited them into his home, it says that he ran off to the herd and chose a fine and tender calf, a ben bakar calf. Fine and tender, by the way, means that it was very high in fat content, as veal always is, and prepared it for them, and he served them the meat, and he served them butter, it says in the Torah, him'ah, and halav and milk, together with bread that was prepared, and this is what he offered them as a meal. Similarly, in chapter 27 of Sefer Bereshith, when Yitzhak Avinu is old and blind and wishes to bless his sons, he sends off his son Esau to hunt apparently some kind of pheasant or something of that nature in the field, to bring back this animal to be turned into the kind of stew, the kind of delicacy that he preferred. And even his wife Rivka, who wished the bracha to be given to Yaakov, to Jacob, and not to Esau, and facilitated this by sending Yaakov off to the herd to bring back two goat kids. We see again that the delicacy that was prepared for Yitzhak Avinu was one based on meat, on animal products. And another example of this, also in Sefer Bereshith, we find towards the end of the book, in chapter Mem Zayin, I believe, chapter 47, where it says that the sons of Yaakov, when they were asked by Paro, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, what is your profession, what do you do? They answered, we are shepherds. We have always, historically, we and our forefathers have always been shepherds, and we have come to Egypt because there is no pasture for our cattle and for our sheep and goats. And so therefore we see, and we know from this source and other sources, that our forefathers were traditionally involved in animal husbandry and shepherdry, And it goes without saying that people whose livelihood revolves around animal husbandry and shepherdry, they themselves consume not insignificant quantities of meat. And so it is throughout the Tanakh, and one could point to many places in Hazal, in the works of the sages, which also indicate that meat and animal products were considered normal and were standard fare throughout Jewish history. The one example I would point to, without belaboring the point, is the well-known statement of the Gemara in the Talmud Bavli, in the Masechet Berachot, Daf Mem Daled Amud Beth 44b in the Talmud Bavli, Berachot, where it states, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that any of all foodstuffs, the healthiest food that one can eat, with the exception of meat, and meat, as it's referred to there, refers to either to beef or lamb or goat meat, etc., or perhaps meat such as that of an antelope or something, one of those kosher animals. That is referred to as bisra in the Gemara, as meat, red meat. The healthiest food that one can eat, other than meat, is an egg, which is a very interesting statement. And certainly quantity for quantity, says the Gemara, an egg is the healthiest food with the exception of meat. So from this we see that the sages certainly were of the opinion that meat and meat products and animal products such as eggs were very healthy indeed. And this is also, as I understand it, an opinion and a school of thought which is gaining traction in the scientific community, in the medical world today. There is talk of the Paleolithic diet. There are many people who have pointed out many of the myths and issues involved with a vegetarian diet. It's not at all clear whether vegetarian is as good for people as it was once claimed to be. It in fact may cause certain medical issues and deficiencies, vitamin, iron, what have you. In other words, the medical evidence and the biological scientific knowledge that we have today does not necessarily point to the conclusion that vegetarianism or veganism or other such diets are in fact healthier for most human beings than the normal, that is to say, the standard traditional diet of human beings throughout the world for thousands of years in all cultures, which have always included meat and other animal products. This is not at all clear. In fact, there is a growing body of evidence and a growing body of scientific opinion that the opposite is the case, that meat, fish, eggs, dairy products, etc., and animal fats are in fact all important for human health. Certainly in the Torah we do not find any support for the theories, the claims made by those who propound the virtues, both the health and scientific value of vegetarianism or veganism, and nor in fact do we find in the Torah the other major motive of some people who do turn to a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle, namely the idea that it is somehow improper or wrong to slaughter living creatures in order to consume their flesh. This idea, I know, does not appeal to all people, and there's no question that many of us are much more squeamish and sensitive about these things than probably our forefathers were. In not very many generations ago, it was common for people to slaughter animals in their backyard. It was something that was people saw it done on a regular basis in the marketplace. And people were much less squeamish about this, as they were much less squeamish about many things, I might add. And whether it's good to be excessively squeamish and sensitive about the realities of life and human existence is an interesting question that one could debate, but I don't wish to go into that right now. What I would say is that the claim that animals should not be killed for human consumption is not at all what we find in the Torah, not in the Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah, and not in the Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the oral tradition of the sages. And common sense and tradition, history, indicate that it is not so, and increasingly medical opinion also seems to have reached this conclusion. So, in summation, the concept of vegetarianism or veganism, and certainly the ideology behind it, which we sometimes hear to do with not slaughtering animals or cruelty, possible cruelty to animals being perpetrated in abattoirs, etc., these are not ideas supported by Torah Judaism. That is not to say, of course, that the Torah in any way countenances unnecessary cruelty to animals. Bar-Hayim, cruelty towards other living creatures is a well-known concept, and it is something which is prohibited according to the Torah. But that does not include raising animals and slaughtering them for the purpose of human consumption, because according to the Torah, there is a hierarchy of living beings on this earth, and at the top of that hierarchy are human beings, and animals are not on the same level of human beings. Now this, I think, is the central issue with regards to many people who propound vegetarianism and veganism. Essentially, these people are claiming, or seem to be working at least on the assumption, that all living creatures are somehow equivalent and their lives are of equal value, and that therefore one living creature should not be sacrificed for another living creature. This idea I believe to be pernicious. This is entirely untrue. It is not at all in keeping with the teachings of the Torah, and it's also not, I would add, in keeping with the facts of life, the reality, and common sense. We all know that leather, for example, is an important commodity which human beings are in need of for many purposes, and this is something which is unlikely to change until and unless, as some people, as some scientists today are beginning to claim, that it will be possible in the near future. In fact, it's already been done to produce meat by growing meat in a laboratory from DNA cells, the DNA of animals. In other words, taking actual animal DNA and causing it to increase and become a steak, shall we say. This has already been done, and I understand there are other scientists who are already able to produce leather, real leather, based on real animal DNA from the skin of animals, and produce leather, as it were, in the laboratory without slaughtering any animal at all. If this in fact becomes a widespread and economically viable technology in the future, whereby human beings will be able to consume meat and provide themselves with leather products based on the real McCoy, so to speak, not on substitutes which are not as good as the real thing, without slaughtering animals at all, this would in fact, I think, be the ideal utopian solution, and perhaps that is where the world is moving. Perhaps this will become the reality in the future.
Is it not true that Rav Kook wrote an essay about vegetarianism in which he stated that, at least in theory, vegetarianism is the ideal and that it would become the norm in the future? And what of the fact that the diet prescribed for Adam and Eve was vegetarian, and only from Noach onwards was the consumption of meat permitted?
It is true that Rav Kook wrote an in-depth essay on the subject of universal peace and vegetarianism. He connected these two concepts, and he does speak of the fact that it would be ideal, it would be desirable that human beings not kill living creatures, sentient animals, in order to consume their flesh. But he does also, on the other hand, himself admit that this is a vision for the future. From what he writes, it sounds like a rather distant future. and it's also a fact that Rav Kook himself was not vegetarian. I myself, whilst respecting Rav Kook immensely, have always felt that with particular reference to this article, this essay of Rav Kook on this subject, I've always felt that he was perhaps influenced, perhaps somewhat over-influenced by the fashion of vegetarianism that was making waves in the world when he wrote that essay. Vegetarianism as a modern movement came into being, at least officially, in the mid-19th century in a number of European countries such as the United Kingdom, and it spread in the remainder of the 19th and the early 20th century, and Rav Kook wrote this essay in the early part of the 20th century. Again, it is not that I do not admit, or cannot agree with the position that it would be preferable, were it not necessary, for human beings in order to eat a balanced and healthy diet. If it were possible not to slaughter animals in order to achieve this, I do not deny that it would be preferable. It would be ideal, in fact. And therefore, as I said before, the possibility that in the future, and perhaps not the too distant future, synthetic but real meat, in other words, meat and also leather products, as I mentioned, will be grown, will be manufactured in industrial plants based on the real McCoy, based on true animal DNA, and thus producing the food and the substances that human beings require without slaughtering animals, or this would at least vastly reduce the number of animals slaughtered for such reasons. This is a very interesting, in fact a tantalizing suggestion, and I myself can only hope that such a thing will become a reality in the future, hopefully in the foreseeable future, and that the slaughtering of animals will not be required, certainly not in the numbers or in the way that it is done today. I again would reiterate that the Torah is opposed, categorically opposed, to any form of gratuitous cruelty to animals, and if this is done, as apparently it is done, based on what I know in many parts of the world, including perhaps in many kosher slaughterhouses, and this is reprehensible, and whatever can be done to undo and negate such practices, any such thing must be done. As for the issue of the diet prescribed to Adam HaRishon and Hawa, Adam and Eve, being a vegetarian one, and meat only being permitted to Noah and his descendants, I would say as follows. If one wishes to point to the diet prescribed to Adam HaRishon and Hawa, Adam and Eve, then one should also be equally willing to accept the diet that is proposed and recommended for Noah and his descendants, which is a diet which includes the consumption of meat. In other words, even if one wishes to understand the first few chapters of Sefer Bereshith, the book of Genesis, in the most literal way, one has to accept the fact, and not just the interpretation, but the fact that the diet that was recommended at the earlier stage was then overturned, for whatever reason, at a later stage. And the simple conclusion must be that for human beings, as we know ourselves, as we are familiar with ourselves and the rest of humanity, in the present stage of human development, the Torah is essentially telling us that a normal human diet includes the consumption of meat and animal products. On top of that, and perhaps even more importantly, I would mention the fact that many commentators and Jewish philosophers, including the Rambam, Maimonides, have pointed out that the first few chapters of the book of Bereshith, Genesis, cannot be taken and should not be taken literally at face value, and rather many of the things mentioned there should be understood in an allegorical sense. It goes without saying, for example, that if the book of Bereshit describes a snake speaking to Hawa, to Eve, that this is not the kind of snake with which we are familiar, because there are no snakes that speak, to the best of my knowledge. And the same is true for a number of other things that are mentioned there, without going into the details, because that is really a separate discussion. And I think we have covered this topic at least in a straightforward and concise manner. And of course much more can be said and written on this subject, and I'm sure will be in the future.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the Rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the Rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.